Hello, this lesson is solving quadratics by square roots. So our normal form for a quadratic equation, our standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And so I want to, sorry, I'm trying to get this little thing off anyway. There are different methods to solve these quadratics. We've done solve by graphing. And so today we're going to do solve by square roots. And the way that you'll know that you can solve a quadratic by square roots is if there's no x to the first power. You're missing the bx term and you only have your x squared and your constant. So if you have an x to the first power, you cannot use solving by square roots. So the instructions will say solve by square roots. And here's the first example. We're solving x squared minus 9 equals 0. Most of the time when we solve by square roots, we're going to get our equation equal to 0 to start with. Solving by square roots is an exception to that. When you solve by square roots, you want to get the x squared by itself, just like you're solving a normal linear x to the first power equation. So we want to add 9 to both sides. And then we've got x squared equals 9. Now we want just x. We want x by itself. So we need to get rid of the squared. And to get rid of things in an equation, we do the inverse. And the inverse of squaring is square root. So I'll square root both sides. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. The squared and the square root cancel. And the square root of 9 is 3. But you also get 9 if you square a negative 3. So when you square root both sides of an equation, you need to put plus or minus, the little plus minus symbol, in front of your solution. And that tells us that both positive 3 and negative 3 are solutions to this. Remember from the graphing lesson that the biggest exponent that you have tells you how many solutions you have. So when it's quadratic, when it's squared, we have two solutions, positive and negative. And it might help you to think about that. If we graphed x squared minus 9, we would get a parabola and it would cross the x-axis at both positive 3 and negative 3. Remember how your parabola crosses the x-axis twice. So you have two solutions, one on the right side, one on the left side. Another way to think about why you have two solutions for this is we could also solve this by factoring, because in this instance, I have a difference of two perfect squares. So if I square root x squared, I get x. Square root of 9 is 3. So difference of squares would be x plus 3, x minus 3. And then if you're solving an equation, you set each term equal to 0. And solve, and you get x equals negative 3 and x equals positive 3. So both the graphing and the factoring show you how you have two solutions. And so you've got the positive and the negative. So when you square root both sides, you have to put the little plus minus in front of your answer for the two solutions. Next example is x squared minus 25 equals 0. And again, if we're solving by square roots, we need to get the square root by itself. So add 25. X squared is 25. And then we need to square root both sides. Square root of 25 is 5, but we need to remember to put plus or minus in front of it. So positive 5 is a solution. Negative 5 is also a solution. Okay, let's make it a little more difficult. 2x squared minus 50 equals 0. We don't have an x to the first power, so I know I can solve by square roots. I need to get the x squared by itself. Add 50. Come on, my thing's stuck. There we go. Two x squared equals 50. And then the x squared is not quite by itself yet. Divide by 2. X squared is 25. Now I have what I had just a second ago when I square root both sides. X is plus or minus 5. Remember, that means if we graphed it, it would be crossing the x-axis at positive 5 and at negative 5. And we know it's a smiley because of the positive 2. Let's try 2x squared minus 40 equals 0. So we need to get the x squared by itself. We're going to add 40. Come on, thing. It's not wanting to function. There we go. Two x squared equals 40. And then divide both sides by 2. X squared equals 20. Now we can square root both sides. We still need to put plus minus every single time, but 20 is not a perfect square. And so you'll remember learning this, especially when you were working with quadratic formula. We need to simplify this radical. We need to simplify this square root of 20. I don't want you to put it in the calculator and get a decimal answer. We need to break this down into a factor tree and get it as simplified as possible. So 20, you could start it however you want. The first thing I think of is 4 times 5. Okay, 5 won't break down anymore, but 4 is 2 times 2. And you may have learned this all different ways, but I always think of if you have 2 of the same number, that number can come out of the house. But anything by itself has to stay home. That would be the 5 would have to stay home. It doesn't have a friend. So then we have x equals plus or minus the 2 that comes out of the house, square root the 5 that stays home. We still have 2 solutions, one positive, one negative. Let's try 3x squared minus 18 equals 0. Add 18. 3x squared equals 18. Divide by 3. X squared equals 6. Now we're ready to square root both sides. X equals plus or minus square root of 6. 6 is not a perfect square, so we need to think about breaking that down. But when we break it down, 2 doesn't have any friends to come out of the house. 3 doesn't have any friends to come out of the house, so we'll just have to leave it. Plus or minus the square root of 6. Okay, a couple more. Five x squared minus 280 equals 0. So we'll add the 280. 5x squared is 280. Divide by 5. X squared is 56. Square root both sides. 56 is not a perfect square. Don't forget your plus minus. So we're going to have to break that down. 56 is 7 times 8. 8 is 2 times 4. 4 is 2 times 2. I like to underline when I get to the end of the branches. So the only thing that has a friend that can come out of the house would be these 2's. I have 2 2's, so a 2 will come out. But this 2 is by itself and this 7 is by itself. If more than one thing comes out of the house, you multiply them. If more than one thing stays inside the house, you multiply them. So my final answer will be x equals plus or minus the 2 that comes out, and then staying home would be 7 times 2, which is 14. One more. X squared plus 25 equals 0. So I need to subtract 25. X squared equals negative 25. Square root both sides. So now, you know the square root of 25 is 5. But if you put in your calculator square root of negative 25, you're going to get an error. And the reason why that is you can't take the square root of a negative. So if you can't get any solution, remember what that means graphically is that your parabola is not crossing the x-axis, and that's okay. So if you're trying to take the square root of a negative, you can just stop right there and say no real solutions. In Algebra 2, you'll learn how to deal with that, what to do with a negative, a square root of a negative, but for now you'll just write no real solutions if you have the square root of a negative. So that's it for that lesson.